Good evening. I'm Gary Schaefer, Director of Glendale Library Arts and Culture. On behalf of all the public libraries in Los Angeles, Ventura counties, and beyond, thank you for joining the Southern California Library Cooperative and my library for this event, which is part of our series, Be the Change: Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Anti-Racism. Be the Change events build collective understanding of systemic racism, elevate the voices and stories of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and inspire our communities to be the change. The series is generously supported by the City of Glendale Arts and Culture Commission and Outlook newspapers. Tonight, in honor of Armenian Genocide Remembrance Month, we are pleased to host Dr. Khatchig Mouradian and Eric Nazarian. Dr. Mouradian is a lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. Earlier this year, Dr. Mouradian was appointed Armenian and Georgian Area Specialist in the African and Middle Eastern Division Near East section at the Library of Congress. Dr. Mouradian has published articles on concentration camps, unarmed resistance, the aftermath of mass violence, midwifery in the Middle East, and approaches to teaching history. He is the co-editor of the forthcoming book on late Ottoman history and the editor of the journal, The Armenian Review. Dr. Mouradian has taught courses on imperialism, mass violence, urban space and conflict in the Middle East, the aftermaths of war and mass violence, and human rights at Worcester State and Clark Universities, both located in Massachusetts, Rutgers and Stockton Universities in New Jersey, and California State University, Fresno. Interviewing Dr. Mouradian is Eric Nazarian, a filmmaker, screenwriter, and photographer from Los Angeles. A graduate of USC School of Cinematic Arts, he is the recipient of the Nicholl Fellowship in Screenwriting from the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences. His first film, The Blue Hour, premiered at the San Sebastian International Film Festival in Spain and won several awards on the festival circuit. He has made films in the United States, Armenia, Mexico, and Turkey, and co-wrote Three Christs, released by IFC Films and starring Richard Gere and Peter Dinklage. We encourage you to email questions throughout the talk this evening to libraryinfo@glendaleca.gov, or you can use the live chat in YouTube. And now I'll turn the virtual mic over to Eric. Eric?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the wonderful team that put this amazing event together for Be the Change. It is my great privilege and honor to speak with my dear beloved friend Khatchig Mouradian on his remarkable new book, The Resistance Network. And I look forward to a lively conversation and honoring, our ancestors who perished 105 years ago, starting with the Armenian Genocide of 1915 until 1923. As an Angelino, as a Glendalian, as an Armenian, as an American, I salute the efforts for all the education in the public arts for putting this together, and especially the Glendale Public Library, our dear friend Elizabeth Gregorian, who first approached me about this. And so I thank you all. Welcome, Khatchig.
Thank you, Eric, for agreeing to do this. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about my work, our work, and on the occasion of as the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide approaches later in April.
Absolutely, absolutely. You have done, and I think it's important to make this very conversational, hopefully entertaining and insightful. Obviously, it is, again, my great honor to be able to be a witness to this monumental work you've done in putting together this book. And just off the bat, I just want to kind of tell for our fellow viewers and audience members and people joining in that this is a book for me, personally speaking, that is not just a book about the Armenian Genocide. I've read multiple books on the Armenian Genocide and research, and you've been so instrumental in guiding me through that process. But this book actually is about agency. It's about humanitarianism. It's about the capacity of people who have been left with nothing to engage their deepest wellspring of survival instincts, and to be able to actually face the tsunami of something so unimaginable that tragically has been continuing throughout the 20th and 21st century. So for me, it's almost like a self-help book, because I reread it during the time of COVID when, the book was first coming out earlier this year. And I want to just kind of jump in, not just your standard questionnaire, and not even just about the origins, but let's talk about your idea to really focus the genocide through a humanitarianism angle. Because most of the time when we look at Armenians and the Armenian narrative of the genocide, we're constantly dealing with the victimization and the horrors that the Ottoman Empire rained like a tsunami upon the Armenian nation. April 24th, 1915 was the murder of our nation. And now 100 years later, we've just experienced a horrific, horrendous war, a very cowardly war waged by Azerbaijan and Turkey against Armenia, with incorporating elements that were incorporated 100 years ago. So let's talk about this idea of humanitarianism and agency, because you've really nailed something here that is remarkably original. And I want you to talk about the origins of that for our viewers and our listeners.
Thank you, Eric. You used the word tsunami a couple of times, so allow me to borrow that word here. When a tsunami hits, we have a situation where, from an observer from a distance, what one sees is the havoc, destruction that the tsunami is wreaking on, everything, right? But a closer look, and we'll see that every single thing, every single tree, every single thing in its way, right, is not just giving in, is not just being blown away, right? Is pushing back. Mm-hmm. Now, overall, the big picture might look like everything in its way is death and destruction, but that doesn't mean that there is no pushback. And in many ways, the Resistance Network is a book about how Armenians and others pushed back, mm-hmm. both as individuals exercising their individual agency, and in an organized manner in the form of an underground, loosely connected, clandestine network that tried to save as many lives as possible, that tried to assist Armenian deportees during the Armenian Genocide, during World War I. And I think that in that sense, what I try to do here is to tell us a history of resistance to genocide, mm-hmm. one that is unarmed, because not all heroes come on horseback. Not all heroes are carrying weapons. It is important to see that there is much more that is going on here when groups, individuals are faced with death and destruction. They will not go, gentle into that good night.
Absolutely. Magnificently and very eloquently stated, my friend. I love, obviously, not all heroes are on horseback. It's funny, when I was reading this, I was rereading it again, in the winter. And I just found myself for the first time thinking so much about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, and this idea, right, of basically there are the warriors, and the world real estate of war, genocide, empire is fought with swords and cannons and guns and now bombs and drones. But then there's this whole other unsung narrative of everyday heroes that perish into the night and are never written about. And I salute you again, without waxing your car, of what a monumental work you've done in bringing out these everyday, unsung, completely eclipsed people like Reverend Eskijian, like Elmas Santurian, like so many others that you were, Beatrice Roner, and all these incredible humanitarians, missionaries, Armenians, non-Armenians, from Mehmet Celal Bey, the governor of Aleppo in the beginning, who was so instrumental in helping with the aid, and then the absolute psychosis of the Ottomans when they picked up on that. What I want to talk about more is the personal front. Why is this subject specifically? Because you've spent your life being such a remarkable scholar, a magazine, the Armenian Weekly editor. You've put together the whole narrative. You've consolidated it in so many facets for the Armenian diaspora and beyond in academia. Why this subject specifically? How is this subject personal to you personally?
Eric, and perhaps you know this story from our earlier conversations. The idea of, this is a book that essentially was born out of my PhD dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with Professor Taner Akçam at Clark University. He was my dissertation advisor alongside Raymond Kevorkian and Deborah Dwork. I owe a lot to these three scholars who guided me through that process. And ultimately, though, this is also a book that stands on the shoulders of survivors. It stands on the shoulders of survivors who told their stories,
Mm-hmm.
and their memoirs, their accounts have been handed down and essentially constitute the source base that I tap into as I reconstruct and tell this integrated history of what is going on in Ottoman Syria, in the darkest corners of the Armenian Genocide in 1915 and 1916 primarily. And so that's critical. And ultimately, the reason I gravitated towards this is a number of conversations and one particular visit to Syria. I say this because in the beginning of my project as a PhD student, I was not planning on working on the Armenian genocide in Syria or humanitarianism or on armed resistance. My focus was more in the direction of a region, the region of Mush and Sasun in the Armenian highlands. Now, a couple of years before the war in Syria erupted, I visited Syria for I have been there multiple times before that, but on that particular visit, I went to Deir ez-Zor. Deir ez-Zor, as you know, is the site of the largest massacre of the Armenians. It is intimately associated with the Armenian genocide, has become a synonym of the Armenian genocide. It's often referred to as the Auschwitz of the Armenian genocide. And this was a place that since childhood I had avoided visiting, even though I was born and grew up in Lebanon. This was a place where, every year, every other year, Armenian school children would go from Lebanon and Syria to visit. And I always refused to visit that place as a child, as a teenager, and then later on as well. And I always said I do not want to go there and cry alone. I want to go there to document, and I want to go there with Turkish journalists and historians as well. And that is what happened. We visited there with a few scholars, a few journalists, and a scholar. The four of us, that particular visit was extremely moving. And in many ways, it was then and there that it became clear to me that this is a history that needed to be written.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, at that point, what I had in mind was a history of death and destruction. Mm-hmm. It is only later, as I was engaging in this research, that I started realizing that even in the darkest corners of the Armenian genocide, there is pushback, there is resistance, even without guns and without bullets. Mm-hmm. And there are ways in which people will coordinate their efforts. I couldn't put this in words for some time, and it was the kind of moment when I realized it. Writing a book about death and destruction, and suddenly realizing that there is a lot more going on here than individuals pushing back. There's coordination. There's an organized way of resisting the genocidal onslaught. And years later, just a few months before the book was published, I came across a quote that now ended up gracing the inside of the book, and I use it. And it's a quote from the book Underland: A Deep Time Journey, and it says, "You look at the network, and then it starts to look back at you." that was what I was doing. I was looking at the experience of massacres, destruction, annihilation in the ground zero of the Armenian Genocide. And suddenly these upstanders, these heroes that are not on horseback and are not carrying weapons, men, women, and children, started looking back at me. The network was looking back at me. And that is when, it is at a later point in my project that the book got called The Resistance Network.
That's beautiful. I mean, it's so evocative, and to go back to our favorite tsunami analogy, it creates a ripple effect, because what's fascinating is about every time you go back to these lands, and you and I have been on multiple trips, you know, to Western Armenia, to the Middle East, something about that part of that world, whatever it is, it calls you back. It keeps calling you back. Whether you're in Boston, whether you're in Los Angeles, whether you're in Fresno, whether you're in Paris, it calls you back. And your calling has led to this remarkable book that, without the bibliography and the index, in 148 pages, my friend, you have done what Leo Tolstoy did in over 1,000 pages. And I'm not trying to, again, wax your car, but you have packed a punch of narratives that have been lost to time. But more importantly, what you've done, and I want to go back to your horseback analogy, is, you know, we in Western civilization or Eastern civilization, we have this obsession with heroes and warriors and memorial days and wars and this and that and bloodshedding, right? But we never actually celebrate the peacekeepers, the endurers, the silent people that survived. And I think we're reaching kind of a tipping point in our zeitgeist globally, especially with the concept of narrative now, owning narrative, of disseminating narrative, of inclusion, of diversity, of indigenous narratives. And the Armenian narrative of the 20th and 21st century is nothing if not indigenous. It's the classic story of, you know, pure migration and empire and the blowback of that. And what I want to talk about is really, in these 148 pages, you managed to create this web, this network, if you will, set in 3 parts, which is basically genocide and urban resistance, which talks a lot about what's happening today, you know, the city to the desert, and then kind of the whole denouement, Dante's Inferno of Derzor. And just let's talk a little bit without getting too much into the book, because I think for everyone listening, and this is not an advertisement, I highly recommend you to read this book page by page, because it is not just a history book. It is self-help. It is a story and an untold tale. But what it really does is paints a picture of an ecosystem of resistance in a way that I personally have never read before. So I just want you to talk a little bit about the actual writing of it. How do you take an elephant and turn it into a filet mignon, which is the way you've done?
Thank you, Eric. And you know, I like the formulation of self-help the way you are essentially phrasing it, because in many ways, self-help is also an idea, a concept that is used in the scholarship when talking about how victim groups, targeted groups are organizing in order to assist one another. You know, they are engaging in what they refer to as self-help. So perhaps on a couple levels, this is true. Now, you know, the challenge for me was to, first of all, make sure that, you know, perhaps in a couple of words, let me say a few words about the sources I use and what I try to do. Now, the historiography of the Armenian Genocide, this is a case, we're talking about a genocide that is the second best studied case after the Holocaust. So there's, you know, expansive historiography looking at different aspects of it. The past 2 decades have been, you know, tremendous for the scholarship in terms of the way it has expanded and the way it has started covering ground that has long been neglected. One of the things that struck me as I was working on this region, Ottoman Syria, the region between Aleppo, Ras Al Ain, and Deir Zor, was how most of the scholarship that looks at the Armenian genocide places the Armenians as victims, and that is the focal point, right? The idea is to show how terrible genocidal process was. And as that is being demonstrated, the victims are rendered absolutely helpless.
Absolutely.
And on the other hand, there's a significant historiography scholarship on humanitarianism, particularly in the West, particularly in places like the New York Nearest Relief in the United States and elsewhere, Europe and elsewhere, and the huge amounts of funds that were raised, the equivalent of billions of dollars in today's money, and the way in which these funds were sent during and the aftermath of the Armenian Genocide to help save the lives of thousands, tens of thousands of Armenians. Now, so in a way, Armenians were either being killed or being saved. This was the bigger narrative. You know, this is how we read about it. This is how we hear about it. The public discourse is very much about this. What was missing is looking at Armenians as actually, you know, actors in this process, right? As people who are an integral part of pushing and resisting the genocide on the one hand, and working with Western missionaries, Western diplomats, local Arabs, Jews, others, and organizing this humanitarian effort and assisting their fellow Armenians who are being, you know, targeted for destruction and annihilation. So in that sense, this was the story for me, and for this, I was overwhelmed with the amount of material I had. I was fortunate to have access to material that hasn't been accessed or has been understudied. But I also was very fortunate with many families who opened their drawers and archives and shared their stories with me. The family of U.S. Consul Jesse Jackson, the family of Reverend Eskijian, many other families. There are sometimes, you know, hundreds of pages of accounts and diaries that only make it with, you know, we have 2 lines about it in the book, right? But of course, the footnotes and the bibliography do justice to all these sources. So in a way, those 150 pages were essentially what I needed to tell this story in a way that recreates the world, demonstrates in a critical way in this kind of integrated history from different perspectives of how nuanced this dynamic was, and at the same time allows for those who want to dig deeper into particular stories to go to the bibliography and the footnotes, which is another 100 pages, and really explore that.
Absolutely. And I think you did a stellarly yeoman's job of putting and culling together all these tributaries into this great big river, but also, you know, to your point, you know, this idea of, you know, it's funny, after I reread your book over the winter, I found myself just really wanting to reread Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, because what you've done is you've brought so much of the oral history of that's been buried into the forefront. And I feel like this is the next wave for academia, for scholarship, for redefining not just the re-traumatization of the Armenian genocide, but also the agency of survivalism and of actually having the toolbox of resisting, which is a whole other unsung war in itself. You know, as you said, not every cowboy has to be on horseback to tell the story. Some do it with scalpels, some do it, you know, unsung in the night. But ultimately, this is a people's history of things that disappear, you know, after twilight, when the light is not shined upon it. And to go back and really excavate these stories through these family narratives is just, again, a testament to the power of narrative, the power of storytelling within history and within truth. And I think that leads me to the next kind of slightly wider canvas, going from a portrait into a fresco, and we'll get to one of our questions soon, is Aleppo. Aleppo factors massively then and now in our consciousness, in our current era during this lingering decade-long war. Give us a rundown of your experience with Aleppo during your life and research before the war and during the writing of this book, and what is the bigger significance of your book now, especially what's happening now with Aleppo?
Thank you, Eric. I will address Aleppo, but before that, since you brought up a people's history, let me say something sort of to follow up on that. And thank you for giving me these very interesting threads to essentially pursue here. Just to give you an example, this is in this book, one of the things that was perhaps the most difficult for me to in the writing process was really writing about certain individuals who dedicate their lives to traveling during the Armenian Genocide during World War I between Aleppo and concentration camps and in the middle of the desert in Deir ez-Zor, and to bring assistance and distribute funds to the Armenian deportees there. And many of these couriers, as I refer to them, will die, will be killed during this process. And that's why we don't have their stories. That's why they don't have memoirs.
Exactly.
In one case, all I know about this one courier who keeps going back and forth and essentially bringing packages, and he was one of the couriers working with the Swiss teacher, humanitarian Beatrice Rohner, and an Armenian man who essentially dies in the desert as he was trying to, again, on one of his forays to assist Armenian survivors and Armenian deportees. All I know about him is his first name and the fact that this is what he did. So in many ways, when we're trying to write and reconstruct the history of any struggle, whether it is the destruction of Native Americans, whether it is, let's not go too far, and we don't really need to cross the ocean to see stories of agency and resistance and survival, right? Whether it is slavery in this country and its legacy. So in many ways, right, a lot of the stories are not told and are not written because those people were busy engaging in resistance and gave their lives to that cause. Absolutely. And there's nothing that's left behind. So in many ways, any act by a historian to reconstruct the history will inevitably rely on accounts of those who survived, or in rare occasions, I also use certain documents that were written on that, during that period, minutes of meetings, which I use extensively from the archives in Aleppo. Couple words about Aleppo. In many ways, Aleppo was a focal point for the genocide and deportation process. As a hub for the genocide and the policies of Ottoman Turkish authorities to deport the Armenian population from across the Ottoman Empire and dispossess them and ultimately lead to their destruction. In this process, Aleppo became a hub. And when a place is a hub for genocide, it is inevitably a hub for resistance to it. And in that sense, Aleppo was a critical place for resistance to the Armenian genocide. You have the local Armenian community of the city. There were around 10,000 Armenians living in the city when World War I broke, as well as other local elites, other humanitarians, are at the core of this humanitarian network that I explore. And the city lends itself to essentially that allows for the possibility of struggling, disappearing in the fabric of in the urban fabric, and organizing and hiding and engaging in acts of resistance. To bridge the past and the present, it's worth noting that the Armenian case, one of the things it does is demonstrates how much is suppressed from the narrative when the actions and the words of the targeted groups are not front and center, right? Every time we read about the accomplishments of human rights organizations, NGOs, it's worth asking ourselves. And now I'm talking about the here and now, not just the past. What about the local activists? What about the humanitarian workers on the ground? The people who are there, the people who are being targeted, who are the people who are being victimized. Is their work being suppressed or erased from the narrative? When we read about these reports by NGOs, human rights groups, that often tout their own work, is there a local narrative that's being suppressed? And that's a critical question that I sort of address in the context of the Armenian Genocide, but it's also very relevant to today's work on humanitarianism and the way in which today we frame narratives of conflict, war, humanitarianism, intervention, etc. And every time we read in the media about crimes and atrocities, it's always worth asking, what about the agency of the victims, right? What are the people of Syria who are being targeted? What are the different, how are they living? How are they pushing back? How are they organizing and resisting? And these are, I think, questions that are worth exploring and giving it as much attention to as we pay attention to what this or that regime, government, militant group is doing in terms of killing, beheading, massacre, and other forms of violence. So in that way, the Armenian case challenges the conventional thinking about mass violence, how the targeted group reacts to it, and what we mean by intervention. And Aleppo, if you look at these community structures, it really shows that at its best, when we try to help a group that is being targeted somewhere else in the world, the best way to think about it is how we can stand next to them and support them in the way in which they want to be supported. Exactly. And make their needs our priorities, and make sure that our voice is not essentially suppressing theirs. And in that form, I think, if we think about action and humanitarianism in today's world, even in today's Aleppo, today's Syria, in that way, I think there lies one of the great lessons of Syria during the Armenian Genocide.
I'm so happy this is being recorded, because there's many a subject to be gleaned from what you just said about agency and humanitarianism, but also relevancy and timeliness, because tragically, the haunting and uncanny broken record of history is repeating itself on multiple levels, with the Spanish flu 100 years ago, with COVID now, with the Armenian Genocide then, with the Yazidis 100 years later, now the Rohingyas, and the list goes on and on and on. And yet there is still, back then we didn't have Facebook, back then, people couldn't do selfies while they were in refugee camps and post it for the world to see. And yet we see now we have this incredible agency of communication and mass information technology. And yet there is this malaise of indifference on so many levels that continues and lingers. And, humanitarianism is this buzzword, tragically speaking, where, the reality is much more stranger and more horrific than the fiction. But I want to go and just kind of, what does it mean to you? Because I think this is a very important subject to discuss.
Imagine that we are attaching the notion of resistance to people's access to this metallic object that propels, little pieces of metal and use gunpowder. Do we really think that resistance only is possible when there's a gun around, when there's a weapon around? It's what I try to do in this book is demonstrate how every individual is trying to push back, is trying to figure out how to survive, help others, and organize in one way or the other. And in most cases, resistance is a spectrum of actions. And armed resistance is just a sliver of that. Yeah. And yes, on posters, in community centers, an Armenian leader or a fedai on horseback with a gun will look very impressive.
Yeah.
And their role should not be, underestimated in any way. But it's important to also think about all those people
Absolutely.
who perished, risked their lives, tried to save as many people possible, and perished doing that without firing a single bullet. And for me, those individuals whose stories have not been emphasized and underlined are an integral part of the history of the Armenian Genocide, and in general, the history of resistance to oppression and mass violence.
Absolutely. And just to your point, thank you so much again for your very eloquent and impassioned answer about heroes and resistance fighters. But it points to a bigger obsession we have as a civilization, right? Of mythology, of wanting to celebrate Sparta and the 300 Spartans and Leonidas against 1,000,000 Persians and the strength. And Musadag is a perfect example of that, thousands of years later. But this whole idea, and especially how fiction and cinema, also has contributed to this idea of the hero complex, superheroes are not people with capes on their back flying like Wonder Woman and Superman. They're people that go to their graves with names unknown, just like your courier. And I think this is really more than anything so exciting about what's happening with our times now, is that when you really dig into the history of oppression and indigenous peoples past, you find this monumental history, this plethora of lost stories that actually should have been the bedrock of what we look at as history today. Yes, absolutely, armed resistance is necessary, but so is Anne Frank, because Anne Frank's diary is a bullet in each word, but in a different capacity, because it gives you the context of a young girl's resisting against the impending doom of what happened to her family. And so I think you serving that tsunami of peaceful resistance and warriors is, I think, fundamental to changing and redefining the narrative. Because honestly, reading these stories in your book, it beats any fiction you can create, because the transcendence of what these people went through with nothing, transcends the very capacity of what we term as hero complexes. And
sorry for cutting you off here.
Please.
Just to follow up on that, you're talking about lost stories, right? One of the things that is lost when we don't think about resistance in that broad sense are the stories of women and children who resist.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, you and I have talked about, some of the people that are central in this resistance network. People like Arak Sejabejian, who is one of the couriers as well and is helping people in Deir Zor. People like Elmas Santurian, this nurse who is catapulted into a position where she assists and saves many Armenian women from being deported and killed. We mentioned Beatrice Rohner, but also some children as well. Some of the critical couriers in Aleppo are people such as John Minassian, who was a teenager. There are children, in these concentration camps that I write about, that are communicating between one camp and the other by secretly, leaving these concentration camps at night and in the cloak of darkness, going into the next camp and then coming back the next day with information. So you have this kind of lost stories, because when the focus is on armed resistance, we're not looking at what everybody else is doing, and particularly the stories of women who are engaged in this resistance, and children are definitely being sidelined.
Absolutely. And that's a very critical, untold kind of gem that you've unearthed. I mean, just everything you said, it was like the mental movie projector in my mind has continued to explode with all this incredible research you've done, because that's what history is at night. These kids running into the desert, communicating information, trying to create some type of an agency. And ultimately, they were doing what they could with what they have, which goes back to that famous saying, right? Do the best you have do what you can with what you have at the time that you have it. And there is an honor and a saintliness to that, without getting too religious or mythological. But I do believe that if there's ever a time in the history of narrative, in the history of dissemination, in the history of access to communication technology, now is that time to honor and celebrate those stories. And again, you've done it in a way that segues, you've created an ecosystem. Your book is not a book that just tells a narrative. It's an ecosystem. It talks about the elements that come together in order for things to go right when everything in the world has gone wrong, when nobody cares, basically, because this is the story is when you're flat on your back like a turtle in the desert, in a concentration camp, what can you do? Just like, this is so important to, the feeling of malaise and uncertainty and indifference and depression that we feel this past year as a civilization. Like, what can we do when all our hands are tied? Well, we have a roof over our heads. We're far different from where our people were 100 years ago. But look at the agency that these people were able to do with circumstances that are unimaginable compared to what we have today. On that note, I just want to segue into the role of diplomats and missionaries, which is another great untold tale of the Armenian Genocide, particularly in the Aleppo theater. And in a way, I just want to segue off to what can today's diplomats and ambassadors glean from these predecessors? Because what Jesse B. Jackson and what Mehmet Celal Bey and what Rosler did, the German consul, I mean, these are monumental contributions that you've touched upon. And please.
Yes, clearly you named three individuals who are critical in the book, who play a critical role in this book and are in constant interaction with many Armenian and other local members of the resistance network. Mm-hmm. And, they're not perfect diplomats or perfect human beings. I don't believe any of the characters that are at the core of this book are, even those who are really, committing the ultimate sacrifice and risking their lives. But one of the threads that perhaps runs through many of these individuals, you mentioned one Turkish official, the governor of Aleppo, until he was removed from his post because he resisted orders to be a critical cog in the machinery of genocide, as well as the U.S. consul in Aleppo, Jesse B. Jackson, and the Walter Rosler, the German consul in Aleppo. One of the things that stands out in their case is the fact that these were not people who were essentially executing orders that were coming from Istanbul, Washington, and Berlin, mm-hmm. blindly, without being mindful of their environment. Mm-hmm. In many cases, these people were doing things that were not part of their jobs as consuls or governors. Mm-hmm. In quite a few cases, what they were doing was actually against what their, what the people above them were telling them to do. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes at great risk for their own reputation, for their own standing, and even for their own safety. We know, for instance, that Jesse B. Jackson, the consul, was being constantly watched by Ottoman Turkish authorities, and who were following his every move. We know that others, in fact, lost their jobs. We talked about the governor of Aleppo, but also I document similar cases across Syria and beyond, and lost their lives, some of them, because they refused to comply with orders that are coming from above. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, much of this essentially raises the question of the difference between blindly following orders mm-hmm. and standing up for what is right. And how do people who are representing a particular government, country, position, collective and group, what's the room here to maneuver? What are the ways in which they can unsettle
Mhm.
the system, the reality, and come out of the shackles, and how the challenges associated with it. But if it is possible to be done in the middle of a world war,
Yep.
in the eye of the storm of genocide, it is possible to be done in other contexts as well. And it
Absolutely.
has been done. In recent decades, we do see many diplomats who become outspoken, and sometimes lose their positions and jobs as they speak out about, for example, the recognition of the Armenian Genocide or other cases, other issues.
Mhm.
And I think it is critical to think about that as a sense of loyalty. The truth has become, a scarce commodity these days, and is constantly being challenged by, by what is often referred to as a post-truth in what is often referred to as a post-truth society. In that kind of environment, commitment to a shard of truth often goes a long way, and leaves a greater legacy than following orders all the way.
Absolutely. And as much as Solomon Tehlirian is a part of our history, Mehmet Celal Bey is a part of our history. By the very virtue of his resistance and being demoted from being the governor of Aleppo, sent to Konya, where he continued, right, resisting against, the CUP and the officials in Constantinople. Then he was put out to pasture, and he was completely forbidden to pursue his political career. Those are actually the evidences that are just as much as a part of the Armenian genocide narrative as there are the resistors. So I think it's important that you've highlighted these stories, because Turks need to know about these people that existed within their history, that resisted, that were eyewitnesses to the genocide, that were testimonies to the genocide, and that they were, in their own way, for lack of a better example, Schindlers of sorts, like Schindler's List. They were on the side of the oppressors, but they actually showed their own agencies the same way that the women and children did on the other side of the line. So the ecosystem that you've painted is so important. I want to be mindful of our time, my friend, in terms of how much time we have left. But one thing that's really one of your most powerful contributions that we don't talk about enough, and I want to definitely make sure we get to this, is bringing to light these buried stories of the survivor narratives, but also the grisly ecosystem of what you very rightfully term as the concentration camps. Because we often, when we use the word concentration camp, we flash to the Holocaust, right? Talk about the genesis of these camps and how they came about in the relation to the Baghdad-Berlin Railway and the German presence in Ottoman Syria. But more importantly for me, did these camps have any influence on the concentration camps 25 years later during the Holocaust? Is there a connection with that? Because there was a very significant German presence in Ottoman Syria.
Thank you for the question. So there are, the history of concentration camps is one that begins in the late 19th century in the colonial context with the British during the Second World War, the South African War, with the Spanish in Cuba. Essentially, the whole term reconcentration is coined there. Valeriano Weyler being one of the early architects of that. The Americans in the Philippines. All of this is happening in the late 19th, early 20th century. So even though the term concentration camp often today is directly associated with the Holocaust, with World War II, with Auschwitz, it's important to think about the genesis as a process that has started in the late 19th century, at least, and then into the 20th century. And I argue that there's this deadly strain of civilian internment concentration camps that is essentially developed first in German Southwest Africa, where the Germans will use it during the Herero genocide, less than a decade before the Armenian genocide. And then, of course, the Ottoman authorities will use civilian internment as a weapon of destruction, as a way of killing Armenians away from the eyes of onlookers, away from urban areas, and essentially in an environment which I also document in the book, where you have disease and epidemics spreading among Armenians, particularly who are in this destitute condition, having been deported and uprooted from their homes. It is, the concentration camps are the place where Armenians are supposed to be sent in order for them to die alone. And in that regard, I argue that the Armenian experience in these concentration camps during World War I is a critical link on this chain of the use of civilian internment as a weapon of annihilation and destruction. In that sense, there is a connection between German Southwest Africa, the Harriet genocide, the Armenian genocide, and World War II. The book is divided in, essentially the second part of the book is large. The first part is focuses on Aleppo, and then the second part, as you know, largely focuses on these concentration camps and tries to really recreate the world of these concentration camps, something that has rarely been done before. Again, here I stand on the soldiers, on the shoulders of memoirs and accounts, and I also build on the work of historians such as particularly Raymond Kevorkian, but also others. But really, this is a circumstance where, for the first time in this book, you have this world of the concentration camp being brought to life again, recreated, with everything that had to do with the way people were being killed there, the way people were living there, the way they were administered, the way they were structured, and ultimately also the way people resisted in those abattoirs of death and destruction. Some of these camps, the one in Meskene, for example, there were days where in a single day, 500 people would die.
Yeah.
And these would be carried away by, and buried in the outskirts of the camp in mass graves. But ultimately, people were not just waiting for their turn to die.
Yeah.
They were pushing back, and their struggles, resilience, and resistance is also part of the story.
Absolutely, brother. And resistance and resilience is the yin and yang of the Armenian experience across millennia, and it's the yin and yang of all indigenous experiences, from the Chiapas Indians who came up with the remarkable saying that they thought they buried us, but they didn't realize we were seeds. That's a Chiapan saying. And the collective unconscious of all resistors. And what you've done is a monumental contribution, again, not to the Armenian genocide alone, but to the power of resistance, to the power of agency, to the power that when you think you have nothing and you've been flattened by a bus of history, you still have the wherewithal to even move a tiny bead of sand, use a bed sheet to shelter somebody who is in need. Whatever you have, pick up a piece of plastic. This, to me, this book is really a paean and not just an elegy, but it is a guiding light, and it is a self-help book, because we have no reason to complain when we have our health and we have the capacity to make change possible. So very lastly, just want to leave the audience with, what do you hope the reader, once they close the last page of your book, walks away with? What is your hope with the longevity and the legacy of this book? Because there's so much to be told. What was your initial hope when you finished and you turned this into the publisher?
It's a difficult question, but perhaps in a couple of sentences, if this book helps the reader and the viewers here and elsewhere to think about the voices of victims and those who are being targeted differently, and look at cases from, individual cases of violence, from that all the way to mass violence, and not just tell the story as one of death and destruction, but also as one of resilience and pushback, I think that would be the one thing that would make my day every day. In many ways, that is what I wanted to emphasize in this book. I tell my students, I often tell them to, in the beginning of a class on any case of mass violence, how would you summarize it, right? Tell me about the Holocaust in one paragraph or in a minute. And it's all about, this is what the Germans did, this is what the Nazis did, etc. Right? It's, the Jewish people are only being on the receiving end of violence.
Right.
And by that, we are suppressing the voices of the victims.
Mm-hmm.
We are suppressing the actions of the victims, the resistance of the victims, the agency of the victims, the dignity. Because ultimately, for every action, there is a reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that reaction might not be as significant. That reaction might not really transform, the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
But in many ways, it is a stand that the victim, the targeted person or group is taking. And that needs to be a critical part of the way we tell a story, of the way we tell about the story of the Holocaust, the Armenian Genocide, or any other case.
Absolutely. And on that note, my brother, I think, to quote one of my favorite authors of all time, Sam Shepard, he said, "A good ending leads to a better beginning." So the ending of your book leaves much to be desired because it just wants you to know, the reader wants to know more. And we look forward to more narratives from your amazing quill and dedication to this research, because you are the epitome of all that, what research and storytelling should be, which is shedding light on the unsung and the unknown that transcends the power of narrative as we know it, and redefining where we choose to put the spotlight on narrative. There are no heroes, there are only resistance fighters. So thank you again. I urge all our beloved friends joining us tonight to please read this book and read it with an open heart and a long vision of how this book can relate to you, because it is truly a game changer. And it is truly a book that is not just a narrative, but it is a contribution to our global humanity. It's not just about the Armenian genocide. It transcends that, and it gives voice in a way that only the committed quill of my friend Khatchig here can do, with love and with absolute dedication. And that's something you could never, never, never quantify. So thank you again, brother. Thank you to our amazing hosts and the GLAC team and Glendale and all people who buy books. Buy books, my friends, buy books. I gave away my hardcover, so I only have a soft cover now, but there's more coming. So get this book, get into book clubs, disseminate. All our love and blessings.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you both so much. I mean, that was just an incredible talk and just important. And, I agree with Eric. We cannot wait to see more writing from Khatchig. So thank you for sharing this very illuminating conversation with us. I would like to invite all of our attendees to visit the Be the Change website to see all our many upcoming virtual events honoring, commemorating Armenian Genocide Remembrance Month, including a discussion of the cookbook Lavash, the bread that launched 1,000 meals, a discussion between experts on Armenia, Artsakh, and the diaspora, and our children's Armenian history challenge as well. Glendale Library Arts and Culture's Reflect Space Gallery is proud to present Sites of Fracture, a diasporic imaginings of occupied Artsakh, a virtual exhibition that brings together diasporan Armenian artists to create a collective counter-narrative to forces of occupation and cultural erasure in the Republic of Artsakh. Sites of Fracture launches April 19th, 2021 in our 3D Reflect Space virtual gallery, accessible at reflectspace.org. And last, be sure to keep referring to our Be the Change website for information about our May events in honor of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And again, thank you for joining us this evening, and a heartfelt thanks to Khatchig and Eric. Please have a very wonderful evening. Thank you so much for coming.